Hello, everyone. This is Dr. Alexander Rosenthal again, the co-founder and director of the MidArc Institute. I'm here with my friend and colleague once again, Dr. Miles Smith, and I'm excited to tell you that we have a course coming up. Miles, do you want to tell us a little bit about that?
Absolutely. Now and through October is a good time to register at the website you'll see on the video with us at MidArc Institute. You will have a chance to look at a great sweep of ideas and history by the comparison of two pivotal figures, Socrates and Nietzsche. These are two names which, even among people who don't read much philosophy, are known in the public. They're household names, and there's a lot at stake in them. So we're going to look at a sort of contrast of two totally polar worldviews through the avatars, so to speak, of Socrates and Nietzsche. And if you'd like to join us, we would be delighted to have you on board. Alex, is there anything else they need to know about that?
There's my email address for MidArc is on that site. So if you have any interest at all, please email me. And I think you'll find that the prices should not be an object to virtually everyone, right? So we're offering, hopefully, a lot of wisdom and a lot of quality at very low prices, and there are not many other places, I don't think, where you can find where you have this sort of option. So what we've been doing up until now is discussing this whole idea of the Axial Age. We discussed, which was this period that Carl Jaspers talked about between about 800 and 200 BC. And this is part of a series, right? We had started with China, we had discussed India, we had discussed ancient Israel and the Middle East, and now we're starting what we could say a little sub-series on ancient Greece. And we have done this under the three rubrics of poets, statesmen, and philosophers. We covered poets last time, this week we're going to cover statesmen. Miles, were there any key points that you wanted to discuss, maybe about what we did, what we went over last time, in terms of a few key ideas that maybe we should keep in mind as we turn to the statesman this week?
Perhaps just the idea of a kind of arc being set. We are today doing what you might call the mid-arc, where perhaps some of the virtues extolled by the poets and the worldview that they developed and the culture among a number of pockets of Greek culture was set or framed, and also that we are sort of en route to the philosophers, not suggesting that the purpose of poets or statesmen is to lead to philosophy, but perhaps it's the case that today we will be talking about some features of the Greek polis, which is to say the Greek city or the Greek city-state, which are unique or distinctive and which help pave the way for the development of philosophy within Greek culture. That's my sort of guiding picture of our discussion. But Alec, would you differ from that or correct me?
No, I wouldn't differ at all. And I just say, like, one of the key things that we'll want to look at is, Plato, the philosopher, talks about Homer as the educator of Greece. And I think one of the things that we discussed last time that was very important was this arete ideal that we have in the famous encounter between Diomedes and Glaucus in the Iliad, where Glaucus says, his father taught him ever to excel, right? Always to seek the highest arete, as it's sometimes called. And so what we're going to see today is the way in which the arete ideal, which is already found in Homer and the poets, gets itself now worked out in this later period of Greek history in the polis. Some provocatory remarks on the Greeks and politics. One thing I think important to note is that the Greek language of speaking about politics, including the word politics itself, is something that has suffused almost every aspect of Greek culture, right? So, of Western culture. So, in a way, just as Athens called itself under Pericles the school of Hellas, in a way, Greece is the school of Western civilization in this respect, right? the birthplace of democracy, of the ideal of the free citizen and of the self-governing polity. It's our political vocabulary of monarchy, aristocracy, democracy, right? All Greek in its derivation. Greece is the origin of our tradition of political philosophy, right? It was there that these questions were raised beyond mythical accounts of the origin of politics. We have these questions. What is the aim of politics? What is the source of political obligation? What is the best regime? What is the relationship between politics and ethics? Who ought to rule? What is the citizen? What are the duties of the citizen, right? All of these questions, which are so central to our notions, to the Western notion of political philosophy, have Greek origins. Whether or not we have reached the same conclusions as the Greeks, right? That's a separate question. But these questions that they raise are perennial. Another important issue is this notion of the statesman, right? Ancient Greece has furnished the culture with examples of statesmanship from Solon and Leonidas, Themistocles, Pericles, Demosthenes, Alexander the Great, which have been turned to again and again. I mean, there's no question in my mind that today in war colleges across the world, Thucydides is being studied and read, right? Statesmanship and grand strategy and all these things. It's no coincidence Thucydides called his work, which we'll discuss a little bit, a possession for the ages, which indeed it has been, right? Because the questions raised in these by these statesmen and the examples they provided of what to do and sometimes what not to do have remained perennially and have been found to be perennially instructive. So with that, I thought I would turn first. So I'm going to proceed in with five themes, more or less chronologically. First is the development of the polis. What is the polis? Of course, the polis is where our word political comes from, right? What is the polis? What was that about? And who are the central, we could say, founding fathers of the two main Greek city-states, Athens and Sparta? Then we're going to discuss the Persian Wars, where the Greek civilization, and we could say in a sense Western civilization in embryo, was forced to fight for its very existence against the armed might of the Persian Empire, and what emerged from that. Then we'll talk about the age of Pericles and the rise of Athens, right? And it was during this period where we have the full flowering of Athenian culture in the arts and in philosophy, and in many, and it was also in political life as well. It was the period of Athenian dominance, which is, sometimes the age of classical Greece is simply called the age of Pericles. So what was that all about? Then the fall of Athens, right? And we'll talk about the Peloponnesian War. And then I'll have a short epilogue, but we probably won't have time to get into it in much detail, on the end of the polis, we could say, the end of the classical era of the polis with the rise of the Macedonians, Philip and Alexander the Great. So with that, shall we get started on the development of the polis then?
Absolutely.
Very good. Okay, so the polis. So the Greeks were very different. I mean, it's probably important to make a contrast here, right? The earliest civilizations that we've already discussed were all more or less monarchies, right? And most of them, the Asian monarchies, and I'm using the term Asia in its ancient sense, which includes Western Asia or the Middle East, which was mostly what the Greeks knew, were divine right monarchies, right? With rulers who were seen in some sense as representatives of the gods, if not in the case of the pharaohs, gods themselves, ruling over the people, right? And so Greece, we see right away, differed markedly from that in that you have the idea of the autonomos, right? Giving the law to themselves, right? The polis, or cities, we could say. Each city, each community was a self-governing community. And this was the strength as well as the weakness of the Greeks, because of course with each city being self-governing, there was very rarely any amount of political unity among all the Greeks, right, except when faced sometimes with a common threat. this idea of the self-ruling community, where, as Aristotle discusses, each citizen is an author of the very law that binds them, right? Each citizen participates in the framing of the laws, right? There's no caste of rulers in quite the same sense that we see in other civilizations, is very central. As Werner Jaeger said, right, he wrote, to describe the Greek polis, to describe the whole of Greek life. So when we use this word political, when the Greeks used the word political, they didn't mean so much, as we may use today, a specific sphere of human activity, but the whole of human life, right? Intellectual, literary, cultural, etc., was lived within the polis in some sense. And again, I had mentioned this idea of Homer and this oddity ideal, right? Ever to excel, the striving for excellence. If Homer is the educator of Greece, we see his influence. We see the influence of this oddity ideal in all the Greek city-states, but worked out in very different ways. So we'll start briefly with Sparta. There we see, I mean, in Homer, the oddity ideal is a quite martial ideal, right? The constant competition among the heroes, right, for the prize of oddity, right, the prize of martial virtue, prowess and courage, and all these martial virtues. This is very much what was developed and cultivated with single-minded focus in Sparta. So the poet Tertius, right, talked about oddity, said when you reach the limits of virtue, or you should reach the limits of virtue, oddity, before you cross the border of death, right? He's a Spartan poet. He said, here is courage, man's finest possession. Here is the noblest prize that a young man can endeavor to win, right? So there's this single-minded focus on the martial virtue, right? August, one of the Spartan kings, said that a Spartan does not ask how many is the enemy, but where they are, right? To give a sense. Now, the semi-legendary founder of the Spartan city-state, Lycurgus, right? And we could think of the statesmen as being kind of molders or sculptors of their people. Was the founder of the Spartan form of education, which was less perhaps paideia as agoge, what they called agoge, which was this training that began when the Spartan was about 7 years old, right? The Spartan was about 7 years old. We have the word Spartan conditions today, and I think if you read about the agoge as described by the ancient authors, you can understand what it means, right? They went shoeless. They had to make their own beds out of straw, out of the elements. They were given one item of cloth by the Spartan polis as their clothing. And they were in constant duress training, right? Sleeplessness, going with limited food and water, right? They had to be used to thirst. And they were constantly, as in the Homeric notion of competition, right, pitted against each other in athletic and martial contests from the age of 7 until about 20, right? So they were taken away from their families. And at the age of 20, that's when their hard military service began. And went on until about the age of 30. And at that point, the Spartan could become a citizen if they made the test, right? So we could sort of imagine. We could sort of imagine, 20 plus years of special forces training as being what it was like to be a Spartan, and and of course we know that even through their practice of weeding out those that they saw as weak and debilitated through the practice of infanticide, right? I mean, there was kind of we could say a dark element as well to the Spartan culture. So that was Sparta. Now we'll take a look at Athens. So one of the earliest figures in Athens, but we won't focus on him, was Draco. We have the word draconian, right? Was known for very strict laws, the death penalty for all kinds of offenses and this sort of thing, right? Rather harsh ruler. And another thing that happened at this time was that the penalty, this was about the 7th century BC, the penalty for going into debt was enslavement at that time, right? And so during periods of economic crisis, as occurred in the 6th century BC, you had many people mortgaging their land to the wealthier landowners, and when they couldn't pay, many were sent into slavery. So then we have, I think he was born around 638 BC, Solon, who's considered one of the great lawgivers in history. He overturns the whole Draconian code. His emphasis, as we see in his poetry, and I think I discussed him very briefly last time, was on the notions of justice, rule of law, and moderation, or the mean. So he frees all the slaves, right, and abolishes this as a punishment. Athens at the time had been an aristocracy, concentrated in the Areopagus, right, which was it was gradually reduced to a law court. But it was the center of aristocratic power. Solon balances this with by giving the citizens a role in the ecclesia, and he established a council of 400, right? So every freeborn citizen, or at least we could say probably, I mean, a lot of scholars think that it was not all the citizens, right? So the poorest classes were not yet included, but there was a great extension of the franchise under Solon. And he set in motion the conflict between the democratic and aristocratic elements within Athenian culture that was to become one of its basic themes. So they always looked to the Solonian constitution as sort of their origin, the Athenians. And he also established trial by juries, a kind of jury, the Halions. Now then there was a period of the tyrants, there's a stratus, that was overthrown at the end of the 6th century, and you had the figure of Cleisthenes. And what Cleisthenes did was basically abolish all the family-based self-definitions, right, which had defined political power in Athens, right, where the older families were the rulers. He instead simply divided the Athenian population into demes, as he called them, based upon where people lived, right, not their family origins. And this is the origin, the demes, the demos, right? This gradually became known as democratia, right, the rule of the demos, the rule of the people. And he established, he opened the ecclesia, the council that all citizens were in. This was a direct democracy, so every freeborn male citizen could participate directly in politics, and he established a council of 500, 50 from each of the demes, that would sort of set the agendas that the populace would discuss. He called his system isonomia, meaning equality under law, right? So this was, so Cleisthenes, who I believe is in the Capitol building, there's an image of Cleisthenes there, one of the important Athenian statesmen. And we'll see that these traditions of democracy, equality under law, as well as some of the much of the aristocratic concern for excellence, right, is going to be incorporated in Periclean Athens. So I think that that covers some of the origins of Sparta and Athens, and the statesmen like Kyrgus and Tertius, we could say, as formative figures on the Spartan side, and Solon and Cleisthenes as formative figures on the Athenian side. And we'll see that these two rivals in Greece, right, really have a tremendous amount of influence. Did you have any thoughts or anything you wanted to discuss on that, Miles, before we move on to the Persian Wars?
No. It would be interesting to see that through. We're moving into of domestication, I guess you could broadly say, right? I mean, the poets start us out, in the Iliad and the Odyssey, with war abroad, so people going out of their homes to wage war, people wandering far from home. As you are painting it from Sparta towards Athens, there's a kind of arc towards a politics, which is to say an urbanity, in which domesticated life and all the benefits of giving farmers a place to sell their wares and so on is coming together. And so it will be interesting to keep in mind what forces are characteristic of that, or what mark that as that sort of train of history rolls on.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So I mean, and what you see is, the Greeks take this notion of self-governance very seriously because they're developing, each city is developing in such different ways, right? Which is a strength on the one hand because each of the members of the community, like Aristotle will discuss, right, they all feel, that they play a role in the laws that bind them. They're autonomous. But this can also be a risk when faced with a mighty enemy, which was to appear in the form of the Persian Empire, which is accounted in Herodotus particularly. And we have this whole issue: can Athens and Sparta and the other Greek city-states join together to meet the common threat? As Jaeger talks about, right, the central theme running through all of Herodotus is this theme of East and West, right? So Herodotus, in the very first part, he writes, "The Asiatics, when the Greeks ran off with their women, never troubled themselves about the matter. But the Greeks, for the sake of a single Lacedaemonian girl, collected a vast armament, invaded Asia, and destroyed the kingdom of Priam. Henceforth they ever looked upon the Greeks as their open enemies. For Asia, with all the various tribes of barbarians that inhabit it, is regarded by the Persians as their own. But Europe and the Greek race they look on as distinct and separate." Now this is, I think, important because it's one of the earliest references to Europe that we have. I mean, and so as Dawson discusses, the Persian Wars are really the moment in which this idea of the West as something distinct really emerged. And you could just imagine, had the Persians triumphed over Greece at this moment in history, there would have been most likely, we don't have crystal balls, but most likely there would have been no West as we know it. It would have been incorporated into the Persian culture. And I just took from Wiki Commons, right, this map of the Persian Empire, and you can see, Greece is here. You can see how improbable, in a sense, the notion that Greece would emerge victorious from this would be, right? You have this vast empire stretching from Thrace and Egypt to the borders of India, right? Able to bring huge amounts of manpower to bear under unified political leadership against this small peninsula of disunited cities, right? So this was really, we could say, a David and Goliath kind of struggle. Well, what started it was, as the Persian Empire is expanding, there are Greek colonies on the Ionian coast which get subordinated to the Persians. And as they're in the process of being subordinated, they appeal to Athens, which was also an Ionian culture, originally, to protect them, right? And the Athenians, foolishly or not, did try to protect them, right? They sent an expedition which provoked the Persian king of kings, the king over the kings, right? I think it's Shahanshah in Persian, provoked them to no end, the small insolent people, presuming to stand up to the Persians, and Darius was determined to bring Greece to heel. Now, not only Athens, but you can imagine if you're bringing an army that moderns have estimated, perhaps 200,000 soldiers. I mean, this is large for a modern army. To bear, you can imagine it's going to be all of Greece that's subordinated, not just the upstart Athenians. And so. One of the interesting things there was a famous Battle of Marathon in 490, which we won't get to too much, but one of the interesting things was the Persians had the custom of proskynesis, right, of lying prostrate in the presence of the king. And when the Spartan ambassadors, what's going to happen between the Persians and the Spartans, right? We know the Athenians are not getting well. When they had a meeting with the Persian king, the Spartan ambassadors, they told them to go prostrate, and they said, "We bow to no man," right? So here you have also a clash of concepts, right? The Greeks, as self-governing people, did not view themselves as ruled over and against a sort of semi-divine ruler, right? Again, this notion of autonomy. So two figures. I mean, we won't be able to go through the whole Persian War, but two figures I'd want to focus on would be Leonidas of Sparta, the Spartan king, and Themistocles, the Athenian naval commander. And one thing I think is kind of interesting is to draw parallels between the virtues we saw in Homer and the virtues that we see in the Persian Wars, right? So Leonidas, we could say, and the kings, the Argid kings of Sparta, were considered to be, by the Greeks, to be the descendants of Hercules, right? So we see these virtues of bravery, courage, and prowess, coming out, I think, quite strongly with Leonidas, but also the sort of cunning intelligence of Odysseus, that in the case of the Trojans, with the Trojan horse and so forth, right, they won ultimately by ruse. Right, so we see, I think, a recapitulation of these traits in these two figures, right? So the story is famously told by Plutarch that when Xerxes asked Leonidas to bring their weapons, he wrote back molon labe, come get them, right? So also the Spartans were famous for being literally laconic, meaning short, people of few words, let's say. So basically, you have this army. Herodotus, I think, says 2 million. Modern scholars estimate it was perhaps 150, 200,000 Persian forces coming down into the Greek mainland, and for reasons that are disputed, most of the Spartan army stayed at home, but the King Leonidas and with his 300 Spartans, together with a few hundred allied forces, go to the pass of Thermopylae to hold the Persians back, and you have the famous saying that they asked King Leonidas, they said that so many arrows will come at you that it'll blot out the sun, and he said, then we'll fight in the shade, right? So he was determined to hold the pass, to hold back the Persian armies, which included elite soldiers from all over the Persian Empire, including their elite force, the Immortals. And they managed to hold the pass, killing thousands upon thousands of oncoming Persians for about a week, but one of the Greeks betrayed the army, according to the ancient accounts, and moved up the Greek rear. At that point, Leonidas sent the allies away, right, except for a very small number, and they fought to the death, right? And as Herodotus tells the story, there was some prophecy that Leonidas that either the Spartan king would die or Sparta would be destroyed, and he chose to die on the battlefield. And today you have the statue of Leonidas over there, which has which has the laconic phrase, "Stranger, go tell the Spartans that we have done our duty and here lie." Right. So one of the most famous battles, although it was a defeat, right? But they fought to the last man. Leonidas certainly embodied these traits of courage. But it's important to remember it was a defeat, although historians argue about what were the benefits, whether there were benefits to holding the pass for that long and so forth. The Persians come down into Athens and burn down the Acropolis, right? They go to the sacred parts of Athens, but perhaps because perhaps they were delayed sufficiently that most of the Athenians managed to get out of the city. Sacred places were burned. But then you have the Athenian commander Themistocles, and Themistocles, so he sends there had been a previous battle, which is sometimes considered a Persian victory, but now Themistocles sends someone to the Persians, telling them that he switched sides, and that there's dissension within the Greek ranks, and all they need to do is hold the Isthmus of Corinth, right? Send their armada. So the Persians send their gigantic armada with 1,100 ships, perhaps over 100,000 men or so, into these narrow straits, which Themistocles had investigated thoroughly, as well as studying the weather conditions and so forth, right? And as the Persians are moving in, they suddenly find they can barely move at all, right? So the very numbers of the Persians were now used against them. And essentially, Themistocles now destroys the Persian fleet, right? So now the Persians that remain on the land are stuck, in a sense, right? And can't really be resupplied and so forth, right? So this is a major, major defeat. At this point, the full complement of the Spartan army joins forces with the Athenians and other Greeks, defeats the Persians at the Battle of Plataea, and we could say that that pretty much ends the aspect of the Persian War, which is concerned with the defense of the Greek mainland, right, in 479 BC. So I think there again, right, these twin traits that we see in the statesmen of courage on the one side and cunning, intelligence on the other, which we see embodied in Themistocles, play a very large role in this unlikely victory. So the next thing I'll discuss is Pericles. But did you have anything, any thoughts or reflections that you want to add?
I guess that seem to have noted one moment at which we might see the making of what it is to be Greek, right? Because you know, dialect aside, there would be some commonality of language, but and commonalities of religion, and the bonds that come with proximity and trade and shared history and things like that. But up till now, we've really used Sparta and Athens as a stand-in for Greece. But you know, even though we have as a starting point Homer as, you know, the educator of the Greeks, so to speak, or some kind of giver of a common lyricism or a common mythos or shared reference point, it's the statesman and the man of action who, as we've just heard it told, in some ways helps forge a kind of Hellenic identity that reaches across very different city-states.
That is actually a great point. That's actually a great point, and I think Herodotus discusses, right, the unifying elements of Greek culture, perhaps giving it emphasis for the first time, of common language, common customs, common ancestry, and all these things, which were, but of course their political system did not represent that, because each polis was its own self-governing city, and so we have this constant tension within Greek history between what we could call pan-Hellenism, which is embodied, for example, in the Olympian Games, right, to which all the Greek cities are invited, right, and on the other hand, a fierce jealousy of local liberty. Right? And it's really a theme that we see in a lot of Western history, right? I mean, you see the United States, right? I mean, there's the history of states, the liberty of the states and the federal government, or, you know, we see this in many different contexts, I think, in Western history, of the localism versus the sense of a broader commonality. And of course, the great tragedy of Greek history is that their common sensibility never coalesced into a political unity, but in another sense, that spirit of local liberty had a lot to do with the greatness of the polis system, which is still looked upon as sort of the classical era. Now I'll look at another great statesman, Pericles, right? So Athens emerges from the Persian Wars for the first time with a kind of leadership role, among the Greek city-states, right? Because of their central role in defeating the Persians and defending the Greek mainland Greece from the Persian invasions. And Pericles, I think, is important for three reasons. He himself came from an aristocratic background, but he was really the person who, perhaps ironically, who brought democracy to its full fruition in Athens, right? So the three reasons I would say is one, his role as sort of the spokesman of the democratic ideal. Two, his role as the patron of culture, right? So the age of Pericles is considered almost synonymous with the classical age of Greece sometimes, right? And so this is the era of where he built the Parthenon, right? Where the sculptor Phidias crafts his works, where you have the great flowering of Greek drama with Sophocles and Euripides and Aristophanes and Aeschylus. This was the period where paideia, as we've discussed it, really emerges, right? This idea of the cultivation of human intellectual and moral faculties, as well as simply their preparation for life as a free citizen, with the rhetoric and philosophies, the era of Socrates, right? And so it's considered such a signpost era in that respect, and also for his qualities as an actual statesman. Okay, so the rhetor statesman, and he's considered one of the great rhetors of human history, Pericles, right? So maybe what I'll do is we'll first look, we'll discuss his role in the Peloponnesian War separately, but start off with some of the important passages from his funeral oration that give a sense of the democratic ideal as it was understood by Pericles, right? So one important thing he says, and this is in Thucydides' rendition, which probably captures the spirit, if not word for word, what Pericles said. So one of the passages that I like, he says, "We alone regard a man who takes no interest in public affairs not as a harmless but as a useless character." Right? So this is a different notion, I think, of citizenship than what is dominant in our time, where we think of a person's connection to their country, we could say, as being about what benefits or rights can be derived from it. Here we have the idea of, no, we want an active citizenry, right? The despot does not want an active citizenry because they're likely to oppose the will of the despot, right? But we want citizens who take an active role in formulating the laws that govern us collectively. So it's this idea, we could say, of a kind of participatory and deliberative democracy. He says that our form of government does not enter into rivalry with the institutions of others. Our government does not copy our neighbors, but is an example to them, right? This exemplary role of Athens, right? It is true that we are called democracy, for the administration is in the hands of the many and not of the few. But while there exists equal justice to all and alike in their private disputes, the claim of excellence is also recognized, right? So Pericles, so a few important ideas. We have the idea of democracy, right, as exemplary, right, an exemplary example of democracy. We have the idea of equal justice, right, equal justice to all. But at the same time, it's melding with this aristocratic ideal of excellence, right? We're not vulgarizing in the course, according to Pericles, in the course of democratizing, right? We want to preserve those aristocratic values of excellence and culture, right? So he says, and that when a citizen is in any way distinguished, he is preferred to the public service not as a matter of privilege, but as the reward of merit. Neither is poverty an obstacle, but a man may benefit his country whatever the obscurity of his condition. There is no exclusiveness in our public life, and in our private business we are not suspicious of one another, nor angry with our neighbor if he does what he likes, right? This is, again, quite different from Sparta, which plucks people out at the age of 7 and puts them in barracks, essentially, right, for the rest of their youth. Right, in Athens, we feel that the polis develops best when each does more or less within limits what they like, right? And he says that we are lovers of the beautiful, yet simple in our tastes. We cultivate the mind without loss of manliness, right? So we could say that there was probably a concern in the background that the excessive cultivation could lead to a loss of martial virtue, right? But the Greek paideia was cultivating, Athenian paideia, I would say specifically, right, was cultivating both the body through martial exercises and gymnastics, right, as well as the mind, right, with philosophy and rhetoric and poetry. To avow poverty with us is no disgrace. The true disgrace is in doing nothing to avoid it, right? So these ideals, we could say, the reason why the funeral oration is, we've returned to it again and again, is because of the ideals of democracy which are embodied therein, and of course the great flourishing of culture in Athens during the time of Periclean rule. Now, of course, one of the things that happens, and one of the things that makes possible some of this, is the fact that the Delian League, the Athenian-led league of Greek city-states that emerged from the Persian Wars, is gradually transformed into an empire, a tribute-paying empire. For one thing, everyone in the Delian League must be a democracy, no choice about it, but they also had to pay tribute to Athens, which is probably what made possible the building program of Pericles and so on. So with that, I will turn to the last phase of Pericles' life, which brings us to the Peloponnesian War. But I was wondering, before we make that transition, did you have any other thoughts to add then?
Not at this time, because I think a lot of our audience who are familiar with the story of Athens are waiting kind of with bated breath to hear what happens.
Right, so if we could call the age of Pericles the rise of Athens, right? Athens emerges from the Persian War as a rising power. We could say the Peloponnesian War is the decline and fall of Athens in some sense. Okay, and I think this tells us an important lesson about statesmanship as well, the importance of good statesmen, right? Because I think it's not coincidental that after Pericles' death, things started to go haywire a bit. Okay, so now Thucydides, right, who's an exiled Athenian general, right, who's exiled, as well as we know. Of course, a lot of this comes from, a lot of what we know about Thucydides comes from Thucydides. But as far as we know, unfairly, because he arrived late to the disastrous Battle of Amphibolus and gets exiled. And in his exile, he writes his account of the Peloponnesian War, which is a remarkable work in many respects. Why is it remarkable? Well, for one thing, it seems to be perhaps the first really scientific history, right? That is, it takes account of the causes of the conflict, not in terms of the supernatural, right, like we have in the Iliad, right, and not in terms of the moralistic reasons which the political actors give for their actions, right? But he's trying to get at what are the underlying causes, right? I mean, he's studying war very naturalistically, and he says explicitly that this is a possession for the ages, not because particularly Athens and Sparta are still hostile to each other, but because the principles and causes that led to this conflict, this strange conflict in many respects, are the same principles that he thinks will be causing conflict through all time, right? And in fact, the fact that it's still studied, like if you go to the Naval War College in the United States or wherever it is, the fact that it's still studied tells us that there is something perhaps exemplary about the discussion of Thucydides. And the odd thing about it is, right, it would be very easy to understand why this war occurred if we had two warmongers in Athens and Sparta, right? But instead we had two rather cautious leaders in Archidamus of Sparta, the king, and Pericles of Athens, right? Two rather cautious figures who didn't really want war. So why do two powers that did not want a war, why do they end up going to war? Okay, now in terms of universal causes, Thucydides discusses three things. Interest, kerdos, fear, and honor, right? He says are the perennial causes of war. And in the specifics, he points to the growth of Athenian power and the fear which this caused in Sparta, right? So we can imagine the complacent, militarily dominant Spartans who rule over their Peloponnesian peninsula, and the upstart Athenians, right, who under Pericles build this huge navy, right, and emerge with all of his moral capital from having defeated the Persians, right, and so we have the established power and this rising power, right, and the tensions which that causes. Now, some of the proximate issues. This is something which is called by theorists, political theorists, a security dilemma, right? Athens decides to build a wall connecting their city to the harbor. Now, why is this important? The reason it's important is because the wall has the potential to largely negate the land advantage that Sparta has, right? Athens, fearing that Sparta is worried about their rising power, feels that Sparta may preempt them by attacking Athens. So Athens builds a wall which partially negates Sparta's land advantage. And so now the Spartans are thinking, well, now our advantage is largely, now Athens can cause all kinds of trouble with our navy, and there may not be as much that we can do on land if they get behind their walls, right? So now the threat of Athens looks even greater, right? And so in spite of their best intentions, it's not about intentions, it's about capacities, about power. And so these two powers begin to clash because neither can be certain of the intentions of the other, but their capacities, Athenian capacity, we could say, is becoming a challenge to Sparta's very power, right? So this is called the security dilemma. Another thing important are alliances, right? Because Athens and Sparta are emerging as the two main political centers, almost every conflict among Greek city-states that tries to involve one or the other, right? So there's a conflict between Corinth and Corcyra, which was their former colonies, and the Corcyrans appeal to the Athenians for help, right, which they cautiously provide, but that very help throws Corinth more and more into the Spartan orbit, right? And so the city-states, the cautious states of Sparta and Athens, in a sense, are faced with this choice: do we aid our allies, or do we abandon them to their fate and therefore lose power and influence, right? And then we have this, and so rather small issues, right, are creating blocks, centers of power between Athens and Sparta, and driving them more and more into conflict. Now we have the Megarian Decree. The Athenians put a trade embargo against the city-state of Megara. And the Spartans, of course, the Megarians probably appealed to the Spartans, and the Spartans then demanded that Athens revoke the decree. Now, there were different elements to, on the one hand, Pericles was a rather cautious commander, right, in his strategy, his grand strategy, right? He said, you must not be extending your empire while you are at war or run into unnecessary dangers. I am more afraid of our own mistakes than of our enemies' designs, right? So he wanted to curb, the very growth of Athenian power was beginning to excite an imperial desire for glory in the Athenian people, and he wanted to curb that, right, because he thought it could end in disaster, which we'll see in a sense it did. But at the same time, Pericles was a great opponent of appeasement, right? So when the Spartans came to him and demanded that the Megarian Decree be revoked, he said, I would have none of you imagine that he will be fighting for a small matter if we refuse to annul the Megarian Decree, of which they make so much, telling us that its revocation would prevent the war. You yield to them in a small matter, they will think you are afraid, and they will immediately dictate some more oppressive condition. But if you are firm, you will prove to them that they must treat you as their equals, right? So it's the idea that making small concessions will lead the more aggressive power to demand further concessions, right? And Athens would be in a weaker and weaker position. So there's always, for Pericles' statesmanship, always the demand for the quid pro quo. If you want something from us, you must give us something, right? Never unilateral concessions, right? So it's an interesting balance, right? Avoiding overstretching hubris on the one side and avoiding appeasement on the other side, right? In Pericles' approach. Now Sparta is now in the position that its allies are worried that since the Megarian, among other things, the Athenians reject other demands, their status is starting to, they're starting to lose the loyalty of their cities like Corinth, and we get Sparta ultimately ends up declaring war. Now, Pericles dies in the year 429. So the war starts in 431 BC. Pericles dies 2 years later. And I think one of the points that certainly Thucydides would want to make is that the subsequent reign of demagogues was like Cleon, who was a kind of super hawk, right? Who wants to fight he doesn't like the caution of Pericles and wants to fight the Spartans on land and so forth. Ends up becoming quite disastrous, right? That was that battle of Amphipolis, where Cleon, I believe, is killed. And anyway, in this grinding war that goes on for years and years, there's a point reached where in 421 where there's a peace, right? So there's the peace of Nicias, which lasts a few years. It was supposed to last, I think, 30 years. It lasted just a few years. The reason for this is, one of the main reasons is that you have Socrates' wayward disciple, Alcibiades, who is in that, lust for glory mode, and he wants to answer the call of certain peoples in Italy, right, in Sicily, well, it is kind of Italy, with respect to a conflict with Syracuse, asking for Athenian help, right? Based on the Peace of Nicias, they should have stayed out of it because I believe Syracuse was an ally of Sparta. But Alcibiades was not one to miss the chance for glory, and with his charismatic rhetoric, convinces the Athenians to launch a major naval expedition to Sicily, right? Which not only violates the Peace of Nicias and restarts the war, but also ends up pretty much destroying the Athenian navy in the course of the disastrous expedition. And Alcibiades, at all events, ends up defecting to the Spartans for a while, and then coming back. So anyway, under this rather miserable leadership, the Athenians are gradually ground down until in 404, and also they're making their rule rather hateful. By, in the case of Melos, the famous Melian dialogue, right, attacking countries for not being their allies, and also coercively, I mean, they've done this for a while, coercively dealing with other members of the Melian League. It became more like the Warsaw Pact, where if you try there, you can get in, but you can't get out, sort of thing. So Athens is gradually ground down in 404. The Corinthians want Athens totally obliterated. I mean, one of the themes is the hatred of the Corinthians for Athens. But Sparta relents, and an oligarchy is established called the 30 Tyrants, some of whom were associates of Socrates, which is important for understanding perhaps some of the resentment against Socrates. And that's pretty much the end of the war. So that's the end of the Athenian hegemony with the Persian War. I mean, with the Peloponnesian War. So I think that pretty well covers that. Did you have anything you want to add?
No, just as we look to the next stage in history, as we conclude this discussion, we're almost starting to see not only philosophy as a discussion point that will follow our discussion of the statesmen, but as something that feeds into the statecraft of the time. So Alcibiades and other associates of Socrates are already figures in the political intrigues you've just been talking about, and in the Macedonian episode, the great statesman is a pupil of Aristotle.
Yes, absolutely. And in fact, Aristotle had to flee Athens after his death famously saying he didn't want to give the Athenians another chance to sin against philosophy. Yeah, I mean, that's just an epilogue. I won't go into it in detail, but again, the great tragedy that I think we see with the Peloponnesian War was the fratricidal nature of ancient Greek society and their inability to really unite. And while sort of miraculously the great the Spartan and Athenian polis did unite against Persia, they were unable to do that again against another threat, which was the rising power of Macedon. And Macedon, of course, we kind of call it the comparison I always use is Russia, right? Which is sometimes considered European, sometimes not. You know, like it's they had a very different system of government. They were a monarchy, and they were often referred to as barbarians, which was the Greek term, the Greek derogatory term for the non-Greeks. But at the same time, they thought of themselves as Greek, and they were probably a somewhat syncretic culture with a Greek-speaking upper class. And right, as you said, Aristotle was born near that area. He came down to Athens to study with Plato, but after the death of Plato, he became the teacher to the son of Philip of Macedon, who's coming down into the Greek mainland, and he wants to unify all the Greeks under his rule. And he is opposed by another great rhetor, Demosthenes, right, the famous Philippics. And Demosthenes is really the spokesman, the last great spokesman for the classical Greek polis, right, and its ideals of the free self-governing community, which is now threatened by, as he would see it, the tyranny of the Macedonians, right? And unfortunately, this was unfortunately for his ideal of the polis, this was not a great success. There wasn't very much unity, and in the Battle of Chæronea in 338, the brilliant son of Philip, Alexander, right, played a leading role in this battle, defeats the pro-polis, we could say, Greeks, and imposes a kind of unity under the League of Corinth. And now Alexander's great ambition is to unify the Greeks against their ancient foe, the Persians, right? And so he sees himself not only as avenging the Persian wars, but also following the line of Achilles. He always carried, I mean, he not only brought philosophers and historians and geographers with him on his journeys, right after, but also Homer, right, and he identified with this character of Achilles, right? And right, so at the age of what, 1920, his father Philip is assassinated, and he takes command of the forces. And probably, quite arguably, the most brilliant general in human history. He basically never lost a single battle in the long road from Asia Minor through Egypt, and then onward across the Persian Empire into India, into the borders of India, before he died in his early 30s, right? And I think a couple of just of this in the sort of epilogue, a couple of important things to mention are, one, the Hellenistic age is a complicated one, because on the one hand, the Greek culture is extended throughout the Middle East, right? But on the other hand, the culture that emerges is no longer really the classical culture of the polis, which is why it's called Hellenistic rather than Hellenic, right? There is a kind of syncretic aspect where the Middle Eastern and Greek cultures kind of merge. So what you have now are monarchies, right? In fact, Alexander the Great introduces the custom of the proskynesis, right, of bowing before him, right, which led to revolts and stuff like that among the Greeks. And both himself and many of his generals, encourage intermarriage with the Persians. So what we have is this crossroads culture that emerges, which is partially Greek and partially Middle Eastern, and that is, that's this. I would argue the same kind of culture which we see in the Byzantine Empire, right, which was a kind of imperial monarchy as well. But of course, we also have to say that there were many things that, many important cultural exchanges, right? I mean, think about the later rise of Christianity, which begins with Middle Eastern Jewish culture, but is translated quickly into Greek and spreads throughout the Greek world, right? So this interaction of cultures also bears a lot of fruit. I mean, the only point would be that it's a new phase. It's a new phase of history. It's no longer really the world of the polis. So that's so we'll just kind of stop there, and hopefully you got a good sense of the statesmen of ancient Greece. Do you have any other thoughts?
I mean, I would just close by maybe just putting a question to you, Alex, and taking a step back. So, you know, across these three podcasts on the Greek aspect of the Axial Age, we're looking at poetry, statesmanship, and philosophy. So, you know, the lyricism or music, action, and thought.
Yeah.
And across all of them, you know, because we're the Petrarch Institute, we're very interested in pedagogy, obviously, and in teaching and education. You began by talking about Homer as the teacher of the Greeks.
Yeah.
You also, though, went on to look at a strong contrast that really started our discussion today between Sparta and Athens, right? Paideia and agoge.
Yeah.
So, do you have any thoughts in pedagogy about the balance between those two models in terms of creating a prosperous, a successful, and a sustainable polis?
Yeah. Yeah. So I mean, I think it's not. It's not coincidence. I mean, it's interesting, right? Because there does seem to be within the world of Athens, right, this constant concern that that the emphasis of culture would reach a point of refinement where they would lose their martial virtues, which would be necessary, say, for the very survival of a civilization. But at the same time, it's very interesting, in spite of the admiration that many Athenians had for Sparta, today there's very little left of Sparta. You know, I'm told by Greeks that if you go to Sparta today, you won't see very much. And in terms of their overall, accomplishments, right? Their military, the military accomplishments turned out to be transitory, whereas the cultural accomplishments of Athens are things that we still very much study today. So, it seems clear that you probably want to keep those things in balance, right? I mean, on the one hand, the intellectual and aesthetic development, but on the other hand, the martial virtues and the basic virtues of courage and so forth remain important to any society, right? I mean, there is kind of a theme of innervation that can happen through the weakening of courage and martial virtues as well. So it's kind of so I think the notion of balance would be rather important, and probably most people I think would agree today that the Spartans did not have a particularly balanced culture.
Excellent. Well, that informative and wide-reaching sweep through really the transformation from a very ancient world to something which contains many of the makings of the modern world. So I hope that the audience found that as interesting as I did, and I hope that it whets their appetite for our third installment in this little series ahead of our course on Nietzsche and Socrates, which we invite you to join us for. And we will reconvene with all of you, we hope, next time for the Greeks and philosophy.
Absolutely, yeah, no, and we'll see that for the philosophers themselves, the questions of politics and the polis remained very central. So I think, one of the things that I hope that you get out of this is a sense of the interlocking nature of different elements within a Greek culture, rather than think of them as sort of specialist, separate, autonomous categories. We see how all these things relate. So I hope this is something that you're getting. And I look forward to seeing you next time, and hopefully I'll see some of you in our course. Take care.